Sir, I'm asking you one more time to step back from the vehicle.
I'm telling you, I'm working. This doesn't need to go further.
Everyone says that.
Here. This is my ID.
That doesn't change anything right now.
You can call it in.
We'll sort that out later.
I'm federal.
The interaction took place at a mid-sized gas station on a weekday morning. It was part of a typical urban route, a location officers often used for brief stops, inspections, or quick breaks. The ATF investigator had pulled in to refuel while running errands related to a routine assignment. For law enforcement, these stops are common, but procedures still matter. Officers are expected to confirm identity and purpose calmly before assuming noncompliance or issuing citations. The rookie officer involved had recently completed field training and was working alone for the first time on this shift. While trained in standard verification processes, he had limited experience handling encounters with professionals from other federal agencies. The investigator's calm demeanor, measured responses, and adherence to standard protocols created a quiet mismatch with the officer's expectations. Small delays in producing identification, or simply the way a document was handed over, can trigger doubt in someone still developing judgment under pressure. This stop illustrates a procedural misunderstanding rather than an overt conflict. The officer interpreted standard verification practices as resistance, which in turn influenced how he engaged with the investigator. The investigator followed normal protocols, presenting credentials, explaining the purpose of his presence, and answering questions succinctly. The officer, operating on assumptions formed from previous minor incidents in training and limited field exposure, treated those responses as insufficient. Nearby, the gas station functioned as it normally would. Background hum of pumps, occasional passing cars, the faint beep of automated check-ins. Witnesses, mostly other patrons, noticed nothing unusual. There was no shouting, no confrontation beyond the exchange of questions and answers, no disruption of daily activity. The subtle escalation happened entirely in procedure. How verification was handled, how explanations were received, and how assumptions guided behavior rather than evidence. From a procedural standpoint, the scenario could have been resolved in minutes. A standard check through dispatch or a quick call to confirm identity would have aligned expectations immediately. Instead, a combination of inexperience, misread cues, and reliance on assumption allowed the interaction to continue beyond what was necessary. While the observer sees only a calm exchange, each small misstep, questions repeated, gestures misread, explanations overlooked, sets the stage for the consequences that follow. The pattern here is subtle and often invisible in real-world policing. Minor errors in judgment, small procedural oversights, and misinterpreted behavior can quietly compound. No one involved acted with malice, yet the structure of authority, verification, and expectation created a situation prime for error. It was entirely procedural, entirely avoidable, and entirely believable in an environment where rules and assumptions intersect. The ATF investigator had been in federal service for over a decade, mostly in roles that required discretion and attention to detail. His work rarely involved high-profile confrontations, and much of his day-to-day responsibility consisted of administrative oversight, paperwork review, and coordinating investigations with other agencies. In the field, he was methodical, always carrying proper credentials, maintaining standard protocols, and documenting each step of his actions. His reputation among peers was that of a reliable professional who rarely drew attention to himself, even when performing tasks under scrutiny. Throughout his career, he had encountered situations where his authority was questioned, but these incidents were infrequent and typically resolved quietly. On one occasion, a local officer had misread his presence at a courthouse, treating him as a civilian visitor. He calmly presented identification, clarified his role, and the misunderstanding ended without further action. The experience had reinforced his understanding that procedural patience is often necessary when dealing with officers unfamiliar with interagency roles. He approached each stop or encounter with the same mindset: clarify identity, provide documentation, and allow official channels to verify any authority claims. His demeanor was neutral, his tone measured, and his gestures minimal, nothing that could be construed as confrontational. Even when others misjudged him, he did not escalate. Instead, he followed standard protocol and allowed verification processes to confirm his position. Outside of work, he maintained a routine life that mirrored the consistency of his professional behavior. There were no dramatic personal events shaping his career choices, no extraordinary incidents that would explain heightened caution or defensiveness. His credibility relied entirely on experience, training, and adherence to rules. This steady approach made him appear confident yet unobtrusive in situations that could otherwise be misinterpreted. The gas station stop, though unremarkable in setting, intersected with this character profile in a way that highlighted procedural tension. The ATF investigator's calm presentation, adherence to rules, and straightforward explanation of authority were consistent with his professional history. Any deviation from standard recognition of his position was not personal. It was a product of situational assumptions and the rookie officer's limited experience. This history emphasizes that misjudgment was procedural, not relational. The investigator's previous interactions demonstrate a clear pattern of methodical, consistent behavior, making the dismissal of his credentials during the stop a notable error in procedure rather than a reflection of his conduct. The groundwork for the misunderstanding had been laid long before the encounter, in the routines of both participants and the subtle interplay of expectation, verification, and perceived authority. The interaction began shortly after the ATF investigator pulled into a gas station to refuel. He parked in a standard pump lane and stepped out to begin routine checks of his vehicle. Nearby, the rookie officer was conducting patrol duties and noticed the vehicle, recognizing it as foreign to the local area. Without prior context, the officer approached and began standard questioning. The first few exchanges were measured, consisting of brief factual questions about purpose and destination. The investigator responded calmly, identifying himself as a federal agent and explaining that he was completing a scheduled assignment in the area. He produced identification and credentials in the standard manner, placing them on the dashboard for visibility. The officer glanced at the ID but did not immediately recognize the credentials, interpreting the delay as hesitation. At this point, the misunderstanding began. The officer assumed the investigator was being evasive, when in reality he was simply following routine procedures for verification. Ambient noise continued as usual. The gas pumps hummed, a vehicle exited the station slowly, and the soft clicks of the payment kiosk could be heard in the background. The interaction was quiet but layered. Every movement and gesture was observed carefully by the officer, and every explanation was mentally filtered through his limited field experience. A small delay in removing the credentials from the dashboard was interpreted as reluctance rather than methodical preparation. The officer asked repeated questions about identification and purpose. Each time the investigator provided the same answers calmly and concisely. There were no elevated tones, no sudden gestures, only procedural compliance. However, the officer's assumptions solidified. He treated clarification as resistance. A single gesture, the investigator reaching slowly for a wallet to produce supporting documents, was misread as evasive behavior. Step by step, the officer's approach became more structured. He asked for license information, cross-checked vehicle registration, and questioned the investigator's timing and route. The investigator responded with straightforward explanations, noting his federal assignment and clarifying the nature of his work. Background activity continued. A patron refilled a coffee cup, a car beeped when returning to the lot, and a faint breeze moved gas station signage slightly. None of these events altered the core exchange. The tension remained procedural rather than social. During this initial phase, the interaction could have ended multiple times. A phone call to a supervisor or a verification request through dispatch would have immediately confirmed the investigator's credentials. Instead, the rookie officer continued to operate under the assumption that something was amiss. Each question repeated, each clarification dismissed, contributed quietly to a procedural escalation. By the time the first few minutes passed, both parties had established their roles. The investigator remained calm and compliant, and the officer remained cautious but convinced of non-compliance. The situation was still minor, still contained to routine questioning, but the trajectory toward a more significant misjudgment had already begun. A single overlooked procedural step, a delay in verifying identity, was enough to shape the interaction for the next stages. The officer repeated his questions, this time with firmer phrasing though still calm in volume. "Can you step out and provide your license and registration again?" he asked, noting the investigator's slow compliance as hesitancy. The ATF investigator responded evenly, producing the requested documents while keeping his movements measured and precise. He clarified his federal status and assignment, stating that the information was already visible in his ID and paperwork. A single bystander, a driver refueling nearby, glanced over but did not intervene. Their presence was incidental, no one gathered to watch, no voices rose. The escalation was procedural, not performative. Each repetition of the officer's questions added a subtle layer of tension. The officer continued to operate on the assumption that the investigator was evading protocol, while the investigator maintained adherence to procedure, emphasizing calm compliance and transparency. The officer asked about the purpose of the stop, referencing a minor concern raised by dispatch, though no actual violation had occurred. The investigator explained the routine nature of his assignment and offered to verify through official channels. This clarification was briefly noted, then dismissed as the officer's attention focused on small perceived inconsistencies, a slight pause in reaching for paperwork, a glance toward the pump, a delayed verbal response. The investigator remained composed, answering each question directly. "I understand your request. These documents verify my assignment and identity," he said, showing the ID once more. The officer's response was measured but firm. "I need to confirm that through dispatch first." There was no confrontation beyond this, voices were quiet, gestures minimal. Still, the officer's repeated assumption of noncompliance subtly positioned the investigator as a subject of scrutiny rather than a professional colleague. A brief moment of apprehension appeared when the investigator realized that the stop had already extended beyond typical procedural bounds. He paused slightly, checking the surrounding area. The bystander's movement remained minor, yet the investigator's body language reflected an awareness that the interaction could have procedural consequences if mishandled. He did not raise his voice or argue, only observed and prepared to provide documentation or clarification as needed. Throughout this phase, the officer did not escalate physically. No restraints were applied. There was no shouting. The interaction remained contained to verbal questioning and observation. Humiliation, if any, occurred through subtle dismissal. Explanations were not immediately recognized, repeated clarifications were treated as insufficient, and the investigator's professional credentials were temporarily minimized in the officer's assessment. Each procedural repetition reinforced the initial assumption. The officer's interpretation of small delays, routine gestures, and repeated answers as resistance created a quiet loop of misjudgment. The investigator continued to follow standard protocol, presenting credentials, offering verification, and clarifying his assignment at every step. Yet the officer's focus on assumed noncompliance guided the interaction's trajectory. The exchange remained limited in scale, contained to a single gas station lane observed by a single minor witness, but it set the stage for the eventual verification of identity and the consequences that would follow. The escalation, while subtle, highlighted the impact of unverified assumptions in professional interactions. A routine stop had now become a procedural misstep, quietly growing in significance without overt conflict or dramatic confrontation. After several minutes of repeated questioning, the rookie officer contacted his supervisor to verify the investigator's credentials. The supervisor arrived within a few minutes, walking toward the gas station pump lane where the interaction was occurring. The investigator maintained his position, placing identification on the dashboard once again and answering direct questions without altering his tone or gestures. The officer stepped back slightly, deferring to the arriving authority. The supervisor requested to see the documentation. He carefully examined the credentials, then contacted dispatch to confirm the investigator's assignment and federal status. The verification was straightforward. All credentials matched the records and the assignment aligned with standard procedures for field operations. The supervisor's demeanor shifted subtly but noticeably. His questions became clarifying rather than investigatory, and the officer's initial assumption was quietly challenged by the confirmation. The rookie officer hesitated. He looked at the investigator, then at the supervisor, and back again. The tension was procedural rather than emotional. There were no raised voices, no hand gestures, no overt displays of panic. Instead, there was a pause, a moment where the officer registered that the previous assumptions guiding his actions were incorrect. The investigator continued to respond calmly, providing additional documentation when asked, maintaining adherence to standard verification processes. The supervisor addressed the officer directly. The individual is verified. This is a federal assignment. The officer nodded, absorbing the information. There was no dramatic apology, no theatrical recognition of error, only the quiet acknowledgement that a misjudgment had occurred. The investigator remained professional, offering no commentary beyond providing accurate details. With verification complete, the supervisor instructed the officer on next steps. The officer stepped back further, allowing the investigator to conclude his refueling and depart. The brief procedural correction resolved the immediate misunderstanding without escalation or confrontation. The investigator collected his documents and left the station, while the officer remained momentarily still, processing the deviation from expectation. The interaction, now fully contextualized, illustrates the impact of assumptions within authority frameworks. Verification processes exist to prevent errors like this. Delays, misread cues, and reliance on perceived noncompliance can escalate routine stops unnecessarily. Here, the intervention of the supervisor corrected the trajectory of events, reinforcing protocol and ensuring the investigator's role was properly recognized. Even though the situation resolved quietly, the officer's hesitation and the subtle shift in authority highlight the procedural cost of misjudgment. The investigator's calm professionalism allowed for verification to occur without incident, yet the earlier assumptions had already introduced procedural complications that would later be addressed in internal review. The discovery of truth was methodical, grounded in verification and absent of emotion beyond recognition of facts. By the end of the encounter, the procedural mistake had been identified, authority properly acknowledged, and the officer's perception adjusted. The quiet correction served as a clear demonstration of how adherence to verification and protocol prevents escalation and preserves professional accountability, even in routine field interactions. Following the incident, the department initiated an internal review to examine the procedural steps taken during the gas station stop. The rookie officer was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome, a standard measure designed to allow investigation without interfering with ongoing duties. The review focused on whether proper verification protocols were followed, whether assumptions about the investigator's behavior influenced decisions, and whether any policies were breached during the interaction. The investigation included interviews with both the officer and the ATF investigator. Written statements were collected, documenting each step of the exchange, the timing of actions, and the handling of credentials. Dispatch records and radio communications were reviewed to confirm timelines and the accuracy of information relayed between the officer and supervisor. Every minor delay, gesture, and question was cataloged, not for punitive purposes alone, but to understand how standard procedures were interpreted in real time. The findings indicated that the officer had acted without confirming identity through proper channels until the supervisor intervened. This procedural lapse, while not malicious, had significant consequences. The department determined that retraining was required and that a formal reprimand or adjustment of duties was appropriate given the potential impact on interagency relations and the professional integrity of field operations. The officer faced temporary suspension, during which additional instruction on verification protocols, interagency communication, and escalation procedures was provided. Supervisors emphasized the importance of consulting official channels before making assumptions, even when minor delays or ambiguous behavior suggest noncompliance. The corrective measures were designed to prevent similar incidents and ensure clarity in professional interactions. Legal review followed, examining whether any rights had been violated and whether departmental procedures had been sufficient to safeguard accountability. No charges were filed, but the incident became a reference point for discussions on procedural adherence and the subtle ways assumptions can influence field decisions. Policy adjustments were recommended to clarify steps for verifying identification and handling interactions with federal professionals unfamiliar to local officers. Media coverage was factual and limited, primarily noting that a misjudged encounter had prompted a departmental review. No sensational language was used. Reports highlighted procedural oversight, verification of credentials, and subsequent training updates. Public attention remained low, but the incident was cited internally as an example of how routine stops can escalate when assumptions override protocol. The ATF investigator resumed field duties with minimal disruption. His documentation of the encounter contributed to the review, demonstrating adherence to professional standards throughout the interaction. The quiet impact of the incident, however, underscored the significance of procedural compliance. Even routine stops carry the potential for reputational and career consequences when small errors occur. Ultimately, the aftermath emphasized accountability, correction, and prevention. Training, policy clarification, and supervised oversight were implemented to ensure that similar mistakes would be avoided. The consequences were procedural and career-focused, rather than dramatic or public-facing, reflecting the calm but meaningful resolution of a situation where assumption, timing, and verification intersected in professional practice. The incident illustrates how assumptions, even when unintentional, can affect professional interactions. When authority is exercised without full verification, small misreadings of behavior or protocol can create unnecessary complications. In this case, the officer interpreted ordinary procedural delays as potential evasion. The investigator, following standard processes, offered documentation and explanations that were temporarily disregarded. The result was not conflict but a procedural escalation that required oversight to correct. This situation demonstrates the importance of relying on evidence and verification rather than intuition. Systems are in place in law enforcement to prevent errors, credential checks, dispatch confirmation, and supervisory review, but the effectiveness of these systems depends on adherence. When steps are skipped or assumptions guide judgment, even minor interactions can become significant events, affecting careers and departmental credibility. Bias does not need to be intentional to have an effect. Officers, like anyone, operate under assumptions shaped by experience, training, and situational cues. In high-pressure environments, these assumptions can inadvertently influence behavior, leading to misunderstandings. Recognizing the limits of personal judgment and following verification procedures mitigates risk and preserves professional integrity. The broader lesson is systemic rather than individual. Policies exist to protect both officers and professionals who interact with them. Procedural compliance ensures that encounters remain safe, accurate, and accountable. In environments where multiple agencies intersect, clear protocols prevent misinterpretation and reduce the likelihood of professional errors. Routine stops, traffic checks, and interagency interactions are opportunities for small procedural missteps to have outsized consequences. Quietly, these situations test the robustness of training, adherence to protocol, and the ability to distinguish assumption from fact. Corrective measures like internal reviews, retraining, and policy clarification strengthen systems and reduce the likelihood of recurrence. Professional interactions benefit from patience, calm verification, and consistent application of rules. Allowing evidence to guide decisions, rather than perceived behavior or delayed responses, prevents minor misunderstandings from escalating. The gas station stop, while minor in scale, underscores how these principles operate in practice and why they're critical to both officer and public accountability. In examining such events, it is clear that procedural clarity and verification create an environment where mistakes are minimized. Individuals perform better when expectations are defined, systems are followed, and assumptions are checked against documented facts. These principles reinforce professional standards and reduce the risk of quiet but consequential errors. Ultimately, the incident serves as an example of how calm, methodical adherence to procedure prevents unnecessary escalation. It highlights the interplay between authority, verification, and professional compliance without assigning blame. Lessons are drawn not from drama, but from real-world behavior, demonstrating that small, disciplined actions maintain safety, accountability, and trust in procedural systems. What do you think about situations like this? Have you ever witnessed or experienced an interaction where assumptions affected the outcome? We'd like to hear your perspective. Sharing your observations can help others understand how routine procedures can escalate when verification is overlooked. Your examples don't need to be dramatic. Small procedural misunderstandings can be just as informative. If you've had experiences in workplaces, public services, or professional settings where clarity and verification made a difference, consider describing them in the comments. How was the situation handled? Were policies followed or did assumptions play a role? We encourage you to follow this channel for more case-based discussions. Our focus is on real-world events, professional accountability, and the ways small choices can have larger consequences. Engaging with these topics helps build awareness about procedure compliance and the subtle factors that shape professional interactions. Your input matters. By sharing experiences and insights, you contribute to a clearer understanding of how authority, verification, and calm procedure intersect.